It was just after dawn when a lone walker set out along Umina Beach, the waves rolling in with a rhythmic crash. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of salt and damp sand. The beach was nearly empty, just the occasional footprint left behind before the tide erased all traces. Then something unusual broke this smooth expanse of sand. At first, it looked like driftwood or a fragment of shell half buried where the waves had retreated. But as they stepped closer, their breath caught. It wasn't driftwood, it wasn't a shell, it was bone. And not just any bone, a human jawbone. The sight sent a ripple of unease through them. The bone was smooth, bleached by time and water. Some teeth were still intact, yellowed with age. Had this washed up from deeper waters? Had it been buried in the sand for years, only to be uncovered by shifting tides? With shaking hands, they reached for their phone and dialed the authorities. When police arrived, the walker described the moment they had stumbled upon it, the way the jawbone had seemed to appear out of nowhere, resting in the sand as if placed there deliberately. But that was impossible, right? As officers marked the area, forensic experts arrived in white suits, carefully retrieving the jawbone and combing through the surrounding sand. If there was a human jawbone here, there had to be more. But there wasn't. No skull, no ribs, no clothing. Just that single, lonely piece of a person whose identity was unknown. And for over a year, that's how it would stay. The forensic team worked quickly, sealing the jawbone in evidence bags and photographing the site from every angle. Investigators mapped out ocean currents, trying to determine where it could have come from. Had it washed ashore from deeper waters? Or had it been buried somewhere nearby, hidden until now? Pathologists examined the bone, estimating it had been in the water for decades. But without a skull or identifying marks, traditional methods of identification, dental records, fingerprints were useless. The police scoured missing persons databases, searching for anyone who might match the discovery, but no active cases aligned with the find. And if no one had reported this person missing, who were they? The case quickly turned cold. No further remains surfaced. No leads emerged. The jawbone sat in an evidence locker, tagged and forgotten. For more than a year, it remained a mystery. Until science changed everything. For over a year, the unidentified jawbone remained a mystery, filed away with no name, no story, no resolution. But in mid-2021, forensic teams decided to take a different approach, one that had only recently begun reshaping the world of criminal investigations. Forensic Investigative Genetic Genealogy FIG. Unlike traditional DNA testing, which relies on matching samples to known criminal or missing persons databases, FIG takes a wider approach. It uses advanced genetic analysis to build a family tree, tracing back through generations, connecting distant relatives, and identifying an individual through their lineage. This method had already cracked high-profile cold cases, solving murders, identifying long-lost victims, and giving names back to those who had been forgotten by history. But could it work here? The jawbone was just one fragment of a person. No other remains, no known relatives waiting for answers. Just a single, isolated piece of bone. The forensic team knew this was a long shot. But if FIG could pull an identity from almost nothing, it could change everything. The process began. The first step was extracting DNA from the preserved jawbone, a task far more difficult than it sounded. DNA degrades over time, and salt water speeds up the process. With no protective tissue or fresh samples, the chances of retrieving a usable profile were slim. If the genetic material had broken down too much, the case would hit a dead end again. Lab technicians worked meticulously, using the latest forensic techniques to pull any viable DNA from the bone. It required precision, patience, and multiple attempts to isolate the genetic material without contaminating it. Days passed, then weeks. Each test was met with uncertainty. Would there be enough DNA to sequence? Could they construct a full profile, or would it be incomplete, another frustrating dead end? Then, finally, success. A full genetic profile. A key that could unlock the identity of the person who had remained unknown for over 4 decades. With the full genetic profile in hand, forensic specialists took the next crucial step, uploading the DNA into public genealogy databases. These databases held millions of records, linking family trees across generations. The idea was simple. If they could find even a distant relative, they could begin tracing backward to identify the unknown person. The system worked like an elaborate puzzle. The algorithm scanned for shared DNA markers, comparing the profile from the Jawbone against countless others. Most matches would be distant third or fourth cousins, people who had never even met the unidentified individual. But every small connection was a clue, a thread in a much larger web. Then the first hit came, a faint genetic link, then another. Slowly, the web of ancestry began to take shape. The matches grew stronger, revealing distant relatives scattered across family lines. With each connection, the forensic team worked backward, methodically narrowing down potential branches of the family tree. The search was leading them somewhere, and then they found him. After weeks of painstaking analysis, the results pointed to one name: Harry George Coleman. It was unexpected. He wasn't some missing person from recent years. He wasn't an unidentified body from a cold case. He was a 17-year-old boy who had died in 1980. The revelation sent a shockwave through the investigative team. If Harry Coleman had died more than 4 decades ago, how had his jawbone suddenly appeared on a beach in 2020? Had his body ever been recovered? Had his remains been properly laid to rest? Or was there a far more unsettling explanation? Something wasn't adding up. The forensic team had identified the name, but the real mystery was only just beginning. Harry George Coleman was just 17 years old when his life abruptly ended in 1980. He was an ordinary teenager living in New South Wales, full of energy and a thirst for adventure. Friends described him as easygoing, someone who could make anyone laugh. He wasn't a troublemaker. He wasn't running from anything. His life, from the outside, seemed perfectly normal. Then, one day, he was gone. No shocking headlines, no massive search operation, just a quiet disappearance that left behind more questions than answers. Harry Coleman's name never became one of those infamous missing person cases. His story never gripped the public. Instead, it faded into the background, buried by time. His family moved on. His absence became a part of their past, and the world forgot. Until 40 years later, when a single jawbone washed up on Umina Beach. Harry Coleman's death had been officially recorded in 1980, but when investigators started digging into his past, something strange happened. The details surrounding his death were vague, too vague. His cause of death was listed, but no one seemed to remember how it actually happened. There was no major news coverage, no extensive records. It was almost as if his passing had been quietly swept under the rug. And his family, they never spoke much about it. It was as if something had happened that no one wanted to discuss. But now, 4 decades later, part of Harry had resurfaced literally. His jawbone had appeared in a place it shouldn't have been. Had his body ever been recovered in the first place? Had he been buried properly? Or was there an even darker reason his remains had suddenly reappeared after so many years? The questions were growing, and the answers weren't coming easily. The discovery of Harry Coleman's jawbone should have provided closure, Instead, it raised even more questions. If Harry had died in 1980, how had part of his remains ended up on Umina Beach 40 years later? Had his body ever been fully recovered? Was there a grave somewhere missing this single piece? Or had something happened after his death, something that disturbed his remains and set them adrift? Investigators looked into burial records. If Harry had been properly laid to rest, then the Jawbone's sudden appearance made no sense. There should have been no way for a fragment of his skeleton to resurface decades later. But what if his body had never been properly accounted for? What if he had never been buried at all? Theories began to form, each one more unsettling than the last. One theory disturbed investigators more than any other. What if Harry hadn't died the way his records claimed? His official cause of death was listed, but there were no details, no paper trail, no autopsy reports that explained what had happened to him. Had there been an accident, a tragic event no one wanted to talk about, or was something else at play, something more sinister? If his death had been properly recorded, why did no one seem to know where his remains were? And why, after 4 decades, had his jawbone suddenly reappeared alone without the rest of him? Something was wrong with this story, and the deeper investigators looked, the more troubling it became. With more questions than answers, investigators turned to the only place that might hold the truth, the past. They combed through archives, searching for anything that documented Harry Coleman's death. Police reports, coroner's findings, death certificates. If his passing had been officially recorded, there had to be a trail of paperwork confirming what had happened to him. But what they found, or rather, what they didn't find, was unsettling. Some files were missing, others were incomplete. There was no detailed autopsy, no clear explanation of where his body had been found, no records indicating where his remains had been buried or cremated. It was as if Harry Coleman had vanished twice, once in life and once in death. Had critical mistakes been made all those years ago? Or had someone intentionally erased pieces of the truth? The deeper detectives dug, the more the case felt wrong, and the only people who might have answers were the ones who had known Harry best, his family. When authorities reached out to Harry's surviving relatives, the reactions were strange. Some were genuinely shocked by the discovery. They had long believed Harry's death was settled. Why would part of his remains be found in a place he had never been known to visit? Others, however, were hesitant, uncomfortable. It was subtle the way certain family members paused before answering, how they chose their words carefully, how some of them refused to speak at all. Why was this case suddenly reopening old wounds? Was it grief? Was it fear? Or was there something they weren't saying? One thing was certain: the discovery of Harry Coleman's jawbone had dragged a long-buried secret back into the light. As investigators sifted through the fragmented remains of Harry Coleman's past, a name began to surface. It appeared in old records, neighborhood accounts, and whispers from those who had known him. A friend. Someone who had been with Harry shortly before he died. This person had never been questioned as a suspect. Back in 1980, there had been no reason to. Harry's death had been accepted as fact. Whatever the cause, the case had been closed. No one had looked deeper. But now, with new evidence and a timeline that no longer made sense, investigators revisited this old connection with fresh eyes. Had this friend been the last person to see Harry alive? Had they witnessed something? Or had they played a part in whatever happened that night? Had they been overlooked all along? The timeline was murky. There were gaps, but some details were clear. The night Harry Coleman vanished, he had been with friends. There had been drinking, laughter, a carefree night among teenagers, the kind that was supposed to end with everyone going home safely. But something happened. At some point in the night, Harry disappeared. No one reported him missing right away. No one sounded the alarm. The next time his name appeared in official records, it was on his death certificate. But the most disturbing part, no one could say for sure what had happened in those missing hours. Had Harry wandered off alone? Had an accident occurred? Or had something far darker taken place that night, something that someone had kept hidden for over 4 decades? As investigators pieced together the scattered fragments of Harry Coleman's last known night, a chilling theory emerged. What if Harry had never been properly buried? Some believed his death had been an accident, something unexpected, something that his friends had never meant to happen. Maybe he had drowned after a reckless swim, or maybe he had fallen somewhere remote, somewhere no one could easily reach him. But instead of calling for help, what if his friends had panicked? Teenagers drinking a night that suddenly turned into something they couldn't take back. Had they hidden his body? Had they buried him somewhere no one would ever think to look? And if so, who had moved it? Because if Harry's body had remained undisturbed for decades, his jawbone should have never ended up on Umina Beach. Had something or someone disturbed his resting place? Had a long buried secret finally come loose? But there was another theory, a far more sinister one. What if Harry hadn't died in an accident at all? What if someone at that gathering knew more than they ever admitted? A fight that went too far, a betrayal that ended in violence, a decision that turned into a cover-up. If Harry had been murdered, his body may have been deliberately hidden, discarded in a way that would make sure no one ever found out the truth. Had his remains been scattered, dumped somewhere remote? Had someone gotten away with murder for more than 4 decades only for time and the ocean to finally reveal a clue they never expected to surface? Forensic experts turned back to the jawbone itself, hoping it might reveal something they had overlooked. And it did. Through careful examination, they confirmed that while the bone had spent years exposed to water, it hadn't been there continuously. The patterns of erosion, the level of wear, the way marine life had interacted with it, none of it aligned with a bone that had been sitting at the bottom of the ocean for 40 years. That meant only one thing. The remains had moved. But how? Had shifting tides unearthed a hidden grave, slowly pulling pieces of Harry's skeleton into the ocean? Or had someone put them there recently deliberately, hoping the water would carry away evidence? And if that was the case, who had something to hide after all these years? The case finally had a name, but it didn't have a resolution. The discovery of Harry Coleman's jawbone answered the question of who the remains belonged to, but it didn't answer the far more chilling mystery. How did he really die? Who knew more than they had admitted? And why, after 4 decades, had part of his body surfaced when it should have been at rest? Was this a simple accident buried by time? Or was there someone still out there knowing exactly what happened to Harry Coleman, watching as his past refused to stay hidden? The identification of Harry Coleman's remains marked another victory for forensic investigative genetic genealogy, a technique that had reshaped modern criminal investigations. For decades, cold cases had remained just that cold, locked away in evidence rooms with little hope of resolution. Some cases lacked fingerprints, others had no DNA profiles to match against existing databases. But Fig changed the rules. With the ability to trace family trees, connect distant relatives, and identify unknown victims through genealogy, Fig had proven itself a revolutionary tool. It had already solved some of the most baffling cold cases, putting names to unidentified bodies, bringing closure to families who had spent years without answers. And now it had brought back a name lost to time, Harry Coleman. But it also raised an unsettling reality. For every case Fig solves, there are hundreds more waiting in the dark. Bones in unmarked graves, skulls without identities, families still searching for missing loved ones. And then there are cases like Harry's, cases where an ID is found but the story remains unfinished. Fake told investigators who Harry was, but it couldn't tell them how he died, or why his jawbone surfaced after 4 decades, or if someone somewhere was hiding the truth all along. Somewhere, the full truth still exists. Maybe it's buried deep in old police reports, hidden beneath missing paperwork and incomplete records. Maybe it's still out there in the memories of those who were with Harry that night, the ones who never spoke up, the ones who told only part of the story. Or maybe it lies in a place no one has searched yet, a hidden grave, a place where the rest of Harry's remains still wait to be found. But the biggest question remains unanswered. Did Harry Coleman die the way they said he did? Or did someone get away with murder watching in silence as his past washed up on shore?